Okay, one more session before we have our 55-minute lunch break. And we're crossing the river now. We're coming off the eastern hill of the city. We're going across the Thames and we're going into Southwark. And Hannah's going to talk to us about the wall paintings found essentially on a very, very interesting either site or series of sites, however you want to look at it, which I think first began to be archaeologically discovered way back in the very early 1980s. There's a lot on the edge of that stream on that island in Southwark. So hand over to you for the last session before lunch. Many thanks. Okay, just talk into that.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And yes, we are heading over to the Roman Southwark site, the Liberty Southwark site. And of course, this site has been excavated in the 1980s. A large assemblage of painted Roman wall plaster was found. And we think that combined with the current assemblage of Roman wall plaster may in fact be the largest Roman wall plaster assemblage ever found in Roman London. Maybe topped by the Winchester Palace collection, but we don't know because the way that the storage box's size works is a bit confusing, but we hope this is the largest. But what that means is when you have such a large assemblage of Roman material, especially when it comes to things like wall plaster in an area like Roman London or anywhere in Roman Britain, is that it gives you an opportunity to study the motifs and schemes and possibly even the evolution of styles, which has really been poorly sort of catalogued since really the beginning of the work of looking into Roman paintings. But of course, I pay homage to Roger Ling and Norman Davey, who really wrote the book on it in 1982, and of course to my teacher, Dr. Ian Betts, who's sitting there, whose work I will show has demonstrated some of the most fantastic examples of the methodology and how to deal with Roman paintings in London. So a little background about the site. Of course, we are south of the river, and of course, we are looking at a series of demolished Roman buildings possibly built during the Flavian period and really largely demolished by the time of the Hadrianic fire. So these paintings were essentially from a particular period of time where most of the site was built out of timber clay buildings, wattle and daub, but therefore the material itself has survived. Now, who's ready to go for a quick trip to the Mediterranean with me? Yeah, I'm sure everyone is, yes. So, of course, when we think of Roman wall paintings, we think of the fantastic standing walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum, but that is not what we typically look at when we look at the typical British assemblage, because that is usually what we look at. Okay. The problem with that is, of course, things are out of context. We don't have a large volcano that buried the city of London, thank God. But in relation to dating the plaster itself, quite oftentimes, because they are collapsed timber clay buildings, we have to reassemble them almost like a very fragile puzzle. And again, I mentioned Dr. Ian Betts, who is sitting in the audience. Some of the examples of how this is done, when you're very lucky, when the wall collapses, when the clay wall collapses, the painted wall plaster is in fact on the other side, and the entire wall can easily be, well, not easily, can be reassembled to a degree of completion. And another good example of why it's important to study sort of clay wall when it comes to Roman painted wall plaster is the fact that sometimes, most of the walls in Roman London and indeed in Roman Britain were keyed. The clay walls were keyed, and in this particular instance, they were keyed using a roller stamp, which allows for the bonding of the mortar onto the clay wall, which then the thin layer of plaster is actually applied. So when people think of Roman wall plaster, they think of the thicker mortar. That's actually not the plaster itself. That's the agent that's used to bond it onto these clay walls. And then what happens is, this is our colleague from conservation, Liz, and these materials are brought back to us and cleaned, and we have to be very, very careful because you can simply not wash Roman wall plaster. You are washing the paint off. And that same fragment is cleaned with very careful wooden tools, and what you get is something like that. And of course, this is a very fantastic example of what sort of a Roman candelabrum is in the Roman first century. Now, of course, we're going back to our site right now, and when we look at where we are in terms of the excavation site, you're really looking at a series of buildings or one large building complex, which is actually quite off the main Roman road. But as you're approaching to London, you would imagine you could see that building. It sort of dominates the first century landscape as you're coming before you turn the corner to cross into where modern day, where the Roman bridge was, into the Roman city of Londinium. And of course, what you have on the right-hand side, or on your left-hand side, is the building that was excavated in the 1980s. And on the right-hand side are bits of the building from the 1980s, but just on the south of that is where our current excavation took place. A little bit more about that building. So 3 to 4 hypocaust rooms were found with a giant water tank and water drains and water fastings. It sounds a bit like a Roman bathhouse was probably built into that building complex. The initial interpretation of it was that it was a roadside mansio, but due to the amount of inkwells and writing utensils that were sort of recovered from this site, we think it may have something to do with a governmental function. Whether it's the original interpretation of a mansio is still relevant today, we won't know until we finish our analysis. So this is one of the few pieces of painted wall plaster found on our site, which is in situ. And this is really some of the best you can get when it comes to, if you imagine the sort of Pompeii kind of Roman London. And you can see you just get above the skirting to where the data would be. All right? But most of the material found, in fact, in some of the larger contexts, are demolished Roman walls with the mortar removed, with the plaster still attached, filling post holes, pits, and being used as makeup layers, which means the original painting is completely divorced from the structures, divorced from the walls, and a big guessing game based on scholarly research and, again, looking at similar styles in Roman Cologne, in Germany, and, of course, in northern France and Belgium and Holland really begins. So before we look at our sort of art show of the Roman wall plaster from Liberty Southwark, I would just sort of like to run through the evolution of Roman wall paintings, because British Roman wall paintings really are a sort of an amalgamation of different styles. And I think when we think about the lovely paintings from St. Albans and early Colchester and Roman London, we are already thinking about a style that is well established not only in the northwestern provinces, but also within the Mediterranean, in central Italy and northern Italy, because as you imagine, when we think about the evolution of it, we're talking from not only the Republic, but even from times beyond. So when Roman Britain is really the sort of new testing ground for Roman wall schemes, we are looking at assemblages and styles that becomes very, very difficult to interpret. So how does this start? Well, the earliest Roman wall painting essentially is quite simple. You are looking at walls that are painted to resemble ashlar blocks and any kind of masonry decorations to give that sort of I can't really afford the masonry building, but at least I can paint and show the style of what was popular at the time, right? And of course, the second style is what everyone sort of imagines, and this obviously is the architectural style, and this is at a time when Rome's cities, or central Italian cities, were exploding with innovations of architecture, and this really is a reflection of the celebration of that. Again, it gives you the idea of the illusion, looking out a window and admiring the developing urban landscape that was happening. And then, of course, we come to the third style, which is very popular, because the third style, being kind of very ornamental-based and very thin candelabra sort of focused, is the style that seems to go towards areas like Germany And of course, in central France, we have the first evidence of the deviation from this third style to what becomes really a northwestern Roman style of painting. And we'll come back to that when we look at the assemblages from Roman London and in particular Southwark. We talk about the fourth style. I'm just going to bring it here that there's evidences of the Roman fourth style coming through into Roman Britain. But again, by this time, it is very much divorced from the common styles in places like Campania, in places like Rome, and we are now looking at different local styles where the artists have been trained already by some of the old masters that came before during the early first century, and they're now appreciating the newer landscapes and styles of their local geographical landscape. So before we get to the paintings, I just want to remind everyone that this is going into press release. So if I can beg you not to take any photos, that would be great. So this is a very exclusive thing. And when we talk about landscapes as well, again, I'm just going to go really quickly through it, that the four styles of Roman paintings are not really defined because the Romans, even at the height of the architectural style, enjoyed things like landscapes and gardens because of the explosion of architecture, the bustling urbanism that existed in Italian cities. They wanted to rely on a bit of tranquility within their own dormices itself, right? And of course, when we look at the architecture style, that does exist, one being from Roman London, and of course, the other one being the painted house in Dover. Now, back to it. We look at we've just finished the excavations recently. I finished the assessment report, but now comes the scientific approach to it, which is you're testing the pigments. And most of the pigments, from what I can see visually, actually is just local earth material taken from the sources of clay, things like manganese for purple and red ochre. But there are bits and pieces of higher quality pigments, such as the Egyptian blue, which is the crushed frit. But what we need to do now is really to examine it through a scientific perspective and look at if there's any imported pigments, such as cinnabar from Spain, and of course bits of gold leaf, which can be invisible to the naked eye unless, of course, tested under scientific methodologies. And this is a picture taken by me in Pompeii, just to give you an idea of what the pigments would have looked like when the painters and the plasterers were working with them. We do have vessels like this in Roman London, and some members in the audience have found some recently, I know. And what that basically means is it's very difficult to transport these pigments across long distances, especially across ships, because this needs to be dry before it reaches the destination of painting. Right, and a big debate in terms of the Roman wall paintings of Britain is whether they're painted in fresco. And I think I'll just really run over the idea of what a fresco painting is. It's essentially when that lime slurry plaster is still wet, the pigments and the colors need to be applied right away, because you have about, on average, 6 to 8 hours before it becomes dry, so dry that the right bonding will not occur between the pigment and the wet slurry plaster. But we do have also a lot of evidence that Roman wall paintings in Britain are actually painted in a tempera style. So not all of them were in fresco, because you find bits and pieces of it peeling off. So this actually, right there, that glass vessel, is actually a piece from one of our assemblages. And you can see this piece is quite small. It's only about 30 centimeters. But look how much effort it took just to reconstruct something that is 30 centimeters in dimension. And now you will see Dr. Ian Betts and I attempting to reconstruct the largest wall. Mind you, I've counted about 30 walls, and this is just one. And you can see Dr. Ian Betts and I disagreeing. We used up most of the tables in the office, and I apologize to my colleagues. You can see the computer screen, what the fresco would look like. Right. So, thank you. And this is not all of it. Unfortunately, Andy Chopping, our photographer, was not able to capture all of it because there is still yet another panel followed by a doorway. But our illustration team was able to recreate it for you. So that's what the entire wall looks like. And of course, it starts with stone imitation, a pink stone imitation, which is quite a popular motif in Rome and Britain, and of course in France and Germany as well. And then it transitions to a nice green band where the intervals are black and the panels are yellow. And of course, most of the pigment, the expensive pigments, were applied on the candelabra itself, the two candelabra itself. What's actually quite important about this is, when we look at this particular style, you think, well, yes, panel paintings are quite common in Rome and Britain, and indeed in France and Germany. But the yellow panel is actually quite rare. There's only a few examples. I would say I've counted less than 4 examples recorded by other units, which talks about black intervals with yellow panels. So this is the design from our site with a close-up shot. The mistletoe, we thought initially they were grapes, but our archaeobotanist colleagues have told us that actually it's mistletoe. And that is actually a known motif in Roman art. And of course, the daisy flowers that you see there as well. And I talked about the pink stone imitation. Well, that's actually divided by a black line in which 2 different colors of wash, one being darker, divides the sort of intervals of the dado area. And of course, the 2 lyres, they may be the earliest string instrument represented on a wall painting in Britain. You can just see the air holes coming out on the bottom, and a bit of the Egyptian blue that exists on the top for the tuning. And here we have 3 different birds with a crane on the left. And I talked about other walls. This is just an example of another wall, which is a lot more plain, but again, is actually quite substantial in terms of how much of it we were able to reconstruct. What's actually quite interesting with this one is the fact that most of the fragment of this wall, especially when it comes to sort of the bottom area, the paint has not bonded properly. And we think that the artist was working in quite a hurry because we think that plaster itself was drying relatively quickly by this time. It may be the last wall they were painting. It may be the last room that they had the last room that they were commissioned to do, before the plaster itself became too dry. And you can just see the paint sort of dripping down because it's not bonding properly. And in fact, if you see the black areas, you can just about make out the red dots where they were really trying to paint in a really sort of hasty fashion, and bits of paint are being splattered everywhere. But you can see the way that the lines and the bands are done, that it's actually done by quite a skilled artist, but just working in a hurry.
5 minutes.
Thank you. And we talk about similar sites in Germany. I've done a fair bit of research, not only in Rome, but also in Germany with some of our German counterparts, and we found very similar kind of candelabrums. In fact, the daisy that you see in the one on the left is actually quite similar to what we have in our Liberty plaster. Now, and then I went to a few other sites in Rome and Britain to see if there was any kind of close comparisons, and I found about 2 to 3 sites in which the schemes and the dimensions and also the hue and the pigments were almost identical. The one on the right is from Fishbourne, And the one on the left is ours. So you can see just how similar they are. Right? And the one on the right being from Fishbourne again, and the one on the left, it's almost the exact same color division. We're looking at a yellow panel with green and transitioning into black and red. The one on the left is actually from Amerging Bathhouse and Bath, the Roman baths in Bath. And the one on the right is actually ours. So you can actually see just how similar these three assemblages are. And it's also more significant because they are also dated to around the same time period. Again, the one on the left being from Fishbourne, and the one on the right being from our site. And another one that I managed to reconstruct is actually quite a well-known decoration. The one on the right is from a site north of the river, whereas the one on the left is from our Liberty site. And you could just see the sort of Egyptian porphyry being imitated with the splashing of paint, followed by the nice red veins and yellow hue of the North African marbles. And that's what it looks like in Pompeii when it's done very, very well. And of course, the one on the left is from a site in Cologne. Again, very similar motifs being transferred over from, obviously, central Italy, then to northern Germany, and then finally to Britain. And of course, other interesting marks, and this has warranted some international attention. This is the only Greek alphabet recorded in Roman Britain, and that is in a piece that is less than 5 centimeters in diameter. We initially thought that this may have been the work of someone who is practicing handwriting, but upon closer inspection by myself and Dr. Roger Tomlin, we realized that this individual had very skilled penmanship. So it's most likely, as other examples in Herculaneum shows, some sort of tally or reference. And of course, this would be currently the only known example of a signed work in the Roman Empire. We have a few possible examples, but they are, we're not 100% sure if they are graffiti, if they're inscriptions, or if they're indeed the work of the artists. But for this one, because we were able to look under a times 20 microscope, we realized that this was actually scored in with a tabulo on santo with the word fecit, which means has made this while the plaster was still soft and wet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Han. That was incredibly interesting. I remember, of course, the wall paintings from Winchester Palace, which I think you referred to earlier, and which Tony McKenna did a lot of work on, and which were displayed in the Museum of London until it shut a couple of years ago. But it does show you the wealth of some of these building complexes, as I would prefer to call them, like I think you did. And we may have a lot of official activities going on, of course, on the Southwark side of the river. Just one other point I might make, if I may, and that is, Han mentioned that things started off there in the late 70s, early 80s. They did because essentially there was a building called Calvert's Building, which stood there on the Southwark Street frontage. There was a lot of argument going on about what should happen with Calvert's buildings, because a lot of the site behind it was dead. Could it be rebuilt? Should the walls be kept? And lo and behold, along came a fireman's strike. And lo and behold, on the last night of the fireman's strike, the building burnt down. Completely accidentally, of course. And I do remember the Green Goddesses, the Army's Green Goddesses, trying to put the flames out. But of course, that led the way towards the first of those so-called, in those days, Calvert's buildings excavations. But a slightly different world back then, I think, archaeologically and in terms of development. Okay, well, look, it's lunchtime. Thank you to all the speakers this morning for the work that they've done here. You've got a 55-minute holiday now from this. So hope to see you all back at 2 o'clock for the start of the afternoon session. So have a nice lunch break, folks. Thanks, Han.